Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this another FusionReactor webinar. The next hour or so, we'll be talking about troubleshooting and identifying issues using FusionReactor 6. And we call this part 1 because there may be some additional things that we'll want to focus on in a subsequent one. We will probably be having some sort of open forum where we'll let people ask questions and deal with them directly. So we'll talk about that when that becomes available in the future when it gets scheduled. But for now, let's go ahead and dive into this presentation. So. Just a quick introduction. My name is Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself. I don't work for the company that makes FusionReactor, but I work with them, and I'm very happy to work with them. Work with them for over 10 years. They're great folks. Really love the product, and that's why I do this sort of evangelization for them and speaking at conferences on their behalf and writing and blogging about it. Just a big fan. I love showing people how to solve their problems, and that's what I do all day, every day. Is as an independent consultant, I solve people's problems, hundreds of clients every year, and all sizes and experience levels and different application servers. So that's where I'm here to help share some knowledge that I've gained in doing that sort of troubleshooting with people. So again, this is going to be on troubleshooting with FusionReactor, and after a brief overview, I'm going to talk about a couple of three broad areas that I want to help you focus on when you're trying to understand and resolve the problem. And as tempting as it might be to dive right into what may seem some slow running request, I would argue, well, hold on a second. It's a good idea to just look at the overall current state of processing as can be viewed in FusionReactor. And we'll talk about the ways it can be viewed and why it's useful to look at that before diving in. But naturally, some people, their first focus is, why is this request running slow? Now, some people coming into a tool like FusionReactor didn't even know that it could tell them, hey, the reason why things are hung up is there are slow running requests. But the point is, assuming there is one or more, we'll talk about how to dig into that. There's several techniques that you ought to use, and they're not always obvious. And this, again, is just sharing experience from my years of working with it. Now, besides understanding one running request, it's also important to understand if you have a situation of many slow running requests, because that's really quite different. Really, honestly, one request running slow isn't a big deal, but it might be a concern for you and you want to resolve it. I get that. But really, your bigger concern is when you have many slow running requests, because in most application servers, there's a limit to how many can run. And once you reach that limit, it will seem that the server is dead, but it's not really necessarily dead. It may just be that all the request threads that can run are busy, and you need to know why are they busy. So we'll use those techniques from the previous section to dive into that and also understand some other contextual stuff that could be valuable to understand this big picture of why do we have so many slow running requests. And then I just want to mention briefly, because we've covered this in another webinar, but I want you to understand that you can also use FusionReactor to understand the cause of a recent crash or restart. Some people come into a tool like FusionReactor lament that after a crash, whatever happened beforehand is lost. But with understanding the right available tools that are in FusionReactor, you can see into what went on before a crash. So we'll talk about that in passing and near the conclusion. And then we'll wrap up by talking about some other upcoming webinars and some other FusionReactor resources to be available, and then some time for question and answers. And I'll try to keep an eye on the questions as we go. And in fact, before we dive into the overview, let me just take a real quick look and see if anybody's had any. Someone says, sorry, there's no sound. Now, would anybody else say that they're not hearing me? Go ahead and write in the question pod if you can hear me, because I had tested things and I thought I'd even had somebody already tell me they could hear me. Yeah. So Kai, whatever, okay, he says he left. That's a bummer. So he had some problem on his end, which I guess he perceived to be a problem on our end, but it isn't, because I'm getting many of you saying you can hear me. So thank you for that. No more need to tell me that. Thank you, everybody. Somebody said they needed to switch audio devices. Somebody said they're using their phone. Sure, you can do it all those different ways. And that person who had that problem, sometimes people don't notice that the problem's on their end. They think it's on the server or the service that they're working with, and that's too bad. I can't tell readily if he came back in. Hopefully he did. And if not, the recording will be there, and the recording definitely will have the sound, so no problems there. All right, let's go ahead and continue. So first, I just want to say that, as with most of these webinars, the audience is presumed to be people that are already using it. We've had a couple of getting started ones. And even for the ones that aren't about getting started, I still understand that some people come to it not knowing it, so I try to be careful and slow in showing some things. Also, you may or may not be using the latest version, or there may be some features of FusionReactor 6 Ultimates that I might mention, and you may not be using that, so I'll be highlighting that. Or maybe you've got all the latest versions and the greatest edition, and yet you're still not leveraging fully the features that we'll cover. So again, that's where we're talking to all these different audiences, so hopefully everybody listening should learn something. I also want to clarify that FusionReactor's features apply to any Java or CFML server that FusionReactor can monitor, which is pretty much any Java or CFML server. So some of you attending here may be Java folks, and you may not know what we mean by CFML server. By that we mean ColdFusion, Lucy, Rilo, Blue Dragon. And for those that do use CFML servers, yep, all those can be monitored. So you can use this with any CFML server. But as you all know, who are CFML people, CFML runs on top of Java under the covers. And you Java people, you can use this with pure Java, and the CFML people can use it with their CFML. It all is the same, really. The features don't change at all. There's like one or two things I'll mention today which will be unique to a CF server, but otherwise everything I'll talk about will apply to everybody. I also want to say that some of what I'm going to talk about today has been presented in more detail in some other webinars, and I'll mention them and I'll give you the links to them, and you ought to go watch them, because I don't want to spend as much time on them in this, because I'm trying to cover a specific set of things that are different from the others, but in more detail covered in the others. Particularly the one I had on post-mortem troubleshooting, post-crash troubleshooting, and one on the Ultimate Edition, and one on hidden gems, and others. So I'll cover them as we go. And then finally, again, the presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back and watch it. You'll be able to revisit some of these links I share, or the particular buttons I click, or some particular detail I share. So don't worry if you miss something, just watch the recording later. And of course, you can ask a question as we go along, and if I see it, I'll try to answer right away, and otherwise we'll catch it at the end. All right, so let's move on to troubleshooting and identifying issues. And like I said, the first thing I would want you to focus on, I think, is you ought to look at the current state of processing of your application server. And for most people, the most common way they'll look at that is this feature in FusionReactor called the metrics web metrics page. Let's go ahead and take a look. I have a particular server right now set up to demonstrate that. At the moment, I'm having a bit of difficulty. Let me get, so I'll try to solve that. There you go. So this metrics web metrics page lets you see in kind of high-level detail overview what's going on your application server instance. And some of you have spent your days here and know all about it. Others maybe you've looked at it but never really explored it. And I don't want to go into detail because we did do that in other webinars, but I just want to say that basically these two top left graphs focus on requests that are running or have run, and the two middle graphs focus on queries, JDBC activity. So queries, updates, deletes, doesn't matter, store procedures, ORM, whatever JDBC-oriented calls. By default, FusionReactor watches all of them. You don't have to do anything to make it happen. It watches all your data sources, all your JDBC URLs, whatever you use, FusionReactor watches it. And the top graphs are focused on how many are running, that's active, and how many have completed in the previous 5 seconds, because this refreshes by default every 5 seconds. So these numbers are every 5 seconds, how many had completed on average during that 5-second window. So that's the dark green, and the dark green number of queries that have run per the past 5 seconds. And then the light green would be if any were running, and the light green would be if any were running. And sometimes you may see some running. When you have a problem, you'll see many running. Often you'll see 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 light green running requests, and that would be bad. You'd want to explore that. And same if you saw a lot of queries running, you'd want to explore that. Or if you saw one query running for a long time, you'd still probably want to explore that. Now the bottom graph focuses on the time, and the blue is of the ones that completed, how long did they take on average, and of the queries that completed, how long did they take on average. And then the light blue is of any that are running, how long are they running, and of any requests running, how long are they running. And there we could see a request that ran for maybe 800, 900 milliseconds. But the point is, I'm just saying you want to look at this graph to see what's going on now, and then maybe in the past, and I'll show you in a moment how to look at the past, but I also want to point out this focuses on the heap. The dark orange is the used heap, the light orange is the allocated heap, and then the top line is your max heap, and it's, excuse me, nice that FusionReactor shows all three. And then this focuses on CPU, and the light yellow is total system CPU, and the dark yellow, kind of mustard color, is your instance's use of CPU. And in this case, I have my instance using a lot of CPU occasionally. I'd want to look into that. And sometimes you'll see that it's not, that it's something else on your box that's using CPU. But anyway, what I wanted to focus on was looking at the previous time, because this is just the current minute. What if you wanted to understand what happened over the last hour? Remember, I'm saying we want to look at this to get a sense of what's going on in general, and not just right now, but maybe the problem happened 5 minutes ago, or there is a problem now and you wonder, has it been going on for more than a minute or two? So this last hour button down here at the bottom changes all 6 of the graphs to focus now on the whole past hour. And you'll notice that they usually change in their look, because now this is averages over minutes instead of every 5 seconds. But it's the same information, just averaged over minutes over the past hour, averaging over minutes over the past hour. And you may see a change in nature, and it might be interesting to see if there's an upward trend in any of these things or a downward trend. So I'm just saying, eyeball that, get a sense of what's going on in general, both now and in recent history. And I've talked about this in one of the Hidden Gems talks, but each one of these links, when you click on them underneath here, they will take you to a whole page of information just about that thing. Like I'll click on the JDBC activity, and this will now change to a graph just of JDBC activity. And at the bottom of the graph, you have to scroll down to see it in some resolutions. I'm waiting for it to appear on my screen. And this should be instant. Whatever is happening here, it's either network or that CPU problem, which it's not FusionReactor. Anyway, look here at the bottom of this graph. It starts out showing the most recent minute or two. You can change it to the recent hour or the recent day or the recent week. And all those can be interesting. And I talked about this more and how these are averages over, like when you're looking at the week view, it's averages over hour time frames, and it'll populate with a graph in a moment. But the point is, you can look at this information back over as however long your instance has been up. Now, in my case, mine's been up for a couple weeks, few weeks, a couple months almost. So I could go all the way back to a week. You might find when you try to look at the week view, you don't see more than a day because you restarted your instance a day ago. It can't go back any further than that. Now, the Cloud Edition, which is talked about in one of the webinars, would let you look at data across restarts. So that's another webinar you'll want to check out if you missed it. That was last 2 weeks ago, FusionReactor in the cloud. But anyway, so I wanted you to see that metrics, web metrics, because you can get some general sense of information about your server, current activity, recent activity, and then you can dive into more details. But also be aware that at the bottom of this metrics, web metrics, there's still more textual information. So for instance, it can be helpful to see, because some people don't know, when did your instance restart? Now I know it says server, but it's not your server, it's your instance, whatever you're monitoring. In my case, Cold Fusion. And it's been up for 74 days. And yeah, this is on a Windows machine, it's been up for 74 days. It can happen if you take care of your problems. There's no reason that the CF instance should go down, other than for maybe OS updates or Cold Fusion updates or whatever app server you're using. But anyway, the point is, sometimes you might be shocked to come in here and find that it did restart today and you didn't know it. I've had people be surprised to come in here and find that it says it restarted a minute ago and they didn't know it just restarted. And as they sit here refreshing the page, it does on its own refresh, they see that a few minutes later, hey, it's restarting again. And they didn't realize it was restarting so frequently. So this is surprisingly valuable, again, as a big picture. How's the server doing? How's the instance doing? But then I want you to see there's other information down here, like how many requests have run and how long did they take on average, and memory use and average total request time, JDBC time, and all kinds of other stuff. And then down here at the bottom, you even get a count of requests by status code since this instance has been up. So I've had 700,000 OKs, and I've had a few hundred or 1,500 errors, and some. Now these, by the way, you might want to look at this one. What's going on with that? I've got some code that's throttling requests. If I get too many requests too frequently from the same IP address, that's usually somebody that I don't want to be throttling me, banging on me. And I've got some different heuristics, so I'm not blocking good spiders and things like that. But anyway, the point is, I start to tell them, hey, slow down, don't come so often. And I give them a 503. If you're interested in that, I can point you to a blog post I did. Just Google Earhart, my last name, throttle, and you'll find it. But anyway, that's why there's 73,000 of those. So 10% of my requests are overly burdensome frequent requests within a few seconds from the same IP address, and I want to handle them. Anyway, that's my own issue that I take care of. You may or may not have that issue. I just wanted you to see that again on this metrics, web metrics, there's a lot of information. Now beyond that, there's also some other stuff that you should check out. If you are on CF, there's a metrics, CF metrics and CF system metrics, and we've covered those in other webinars. I'll leave you to explore those if you are running on CF. I also want you to notice these request pages. There's request activity, which focuses on, are there any running right now? Now sometimes you'll come to this and there's none running right now. That's not a problem. That means I don't have any long running requests. Now you could look at that and go, oh my gosh, have I had any running? Is the server not doing anything? Where's all my customers? No, this is what's running right now at this moment. There may not be anything at this moment, but if you come to the request history, that shows you the most recent 100 requests in order of most recent, and it's 1315 on my machine, and it's 1315 I've had requests, lots of requests at 1315 and 1314, and you may have more per second. But anyway, the point is you can look at the most recent requests. That's the history. But again, I want you to look at this information like, how can I understand what's been going on? And sometimes the history alone is interesting, but usually people want to look at what's been slow. So under requests, longest requests, you can focus on what have been the 100 slowest requests since your app server came up, in my case called Fusion. And this is in descending order of duration. So yeah, I had some 300 plus second requests, 4 of them here. Now, it also can be interesting to look sometimes and pay attention to, did they all happen around the same time? And sure enough, these did. 339, 16, 16, 16, and this one too. So there was some problem at that time, and I'm going to show you in a moment how you can dive into the details, and we might find out that much of this time was waiting for queries. So we'll deal with digging into them in a moment, but I just want you to, again, get the big picture. So for instance, what I take away from this is today's March 1st, well, sorry, this is the longest request. So this is in descending order of duration. What I also want people to notice is that there's a slow requests. The difference is this is not the 100 slowest since the instance came up. It's the 100 most recent that were slow, slow being 8 seconds or slower. That's the default, and we talked about configuring that in another webinar on configuring FusionReactor. But the point is, I want you to look at this because this focuses on recent time. So again, remember it's 1315 or 1317 on my server. Well, this is telling me that today, March 1st, the last time I had slow requests was 15 minutes ago. There was 2 of them at almost the same second. And we might even see they were from the same IP address, but not necessarily. Anyway, they're around the same duration. I might go look into that. But then beyond that, the last time before that was a half hour before that, and 20 minutes before that. And I could just keep going down here. And again, my point here is you want to look at the big picture, and assuming this problem has happened recently, look and see, when did they happen? Did they happen in a cluster? Is there anything you can get from looking at this? So that's the most recent slow requests. And then, again, we'll dive into the details of them in a moment. And then I want you to see, there's still more here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. But I want you to notice if you scroll down, there's also JDBC activity, JDBC history, JDBC longest and slow queries, or they say transactions. So this would be if there were any queries running right now, and there probably won't be. Queries are often so fast you never catch them running. But the JDBC history would definitely show me the most recent 100 queries that ran. Now, I'm not saying this is useful. Usually it's not useful. I'm just saying pay attention, because if you think something's like not running, requests aren't running, or everything's slow and you're panicking that you think the whole thing is crashing and down, but you come into this history and you go, hey, wait a second, in the last 20 seconds, or this is not even the last 1 second, in the last 1 second, here's all these queries that are running, and they're running in under a millisecond. I don't have some severe problem. If there's none running now, and this history says there's none running recently slow, then the problem may be longer ago, and I could keep paging down here and see how far back in time, what's been slow, and I could have watched those times. But that's where that slow thing is so valuable. So if I come to JDBC, sorry that I'm moving up and down a little bit on you, but if I go to JDBC slow transactions, Now remember, this is focusing on what have been the 100 most recent queries that were slow, and it's not yet populated. It will in a moment, because they'll all be red because they're slow. And in the case of FusionReactor, slow is 3 seconds for a query. So these are the 100 most recent queries that were slow. And again, if I look here, I've only had 3 in the past hour, 1207, 1208, 1300. And I'm just saying that's valuable to get a big picture. How's my server doing? You could say, huh, I've executed a lot of queries. I just saw in 1 second I had done dozens, and I've only had 3 in the past hour that were slow. And they were only several seconds or a few seconds, so maybe that's not even a big deal, but I'm trying to say you want to focus on the big picture. Sometimes you'll get something out of looking at that big picture. Okay, so that's my goal here. Let's go back to the presentation. And I just took a quick look to see if there are any questions, and I don't see any, so that's good. So these are the things I've showed you. I put these on here so that when you come back and watch the recording later, you can be reminded of these things that we did. Also, sometimes your concern is going to be whether maybe there's a lot of sessions, web application sessions, and that's viewable in FusionReactor. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a multi-monitor problem. I apologize for that. So I'm saying up here in this user sessions, up in the top left corner, user, it's like third down from the top if we're scrolled up to the top. User sessions. You might be surprised if you have not ever paid attention to how many sessions you have to see how many you have. This down here is tracking in the most recent couple minutes how many sessions do I have, and I could look at the hour and the day and the week, and sometimes you'll see that your sessions act very strangely. The count of sessions acts very strangely. Maybe it rises significantly at times. Now I haven't had any because I've dealt with my session problems from spiders and bots and hackers and things like that, but I've helped many people who found out they had 100,000 sessions, 200,000 sessions. The most I ever saw was 400,000 sessions. But for some people, even if they had 20,000 sessions, they might go, that doesn't make sense. Our sessions only last 20 minutes, and we think we maybe have 1,000 people logged on at a time. How could we have 20,000 sessions in 20 minutes? So again, that's not something I want to dive into. I'm just saying that you might want to look at this sessions page. Again, it's user sessions in FusionReactor 6 and above, and you might be surprised to find what it says there. Again, we're focused on looking at the big picture. What are some things that you might see before you dive into specifics of any particular slow requests? And there's also a resources page in FusionReactor and a system resources in the Enterprise Edition. Again, I've gone over those in some of the other talks, so I'll just point those out. Just we're saying look at the big picture, because sometimes you'll get a sense of something going on that's bigger than you thought when you presumed it might be some slow request. But now let's focus on, you do find you either have currently some slow request while it's running, or it's been slow in the recent past. Now, I don't have any running slow at the moment, so I'm going to pick one that was slow in the recent past, and everything I'm about to tell you can be done, whether it's, almost everything can be done, whether it's running still or had run in the recent past. So if we look at my requests, slow requests, let's go to that longest request. Remember we had some that were 300 seconds? And again, I know when you're trying to solve a problem that's happening now, you want to focus on the ones that are running, but since I don't have any at the moment running slow, this is what you could do, whether they were running or had finished. When you see the list of the requests and one is running or has run slow in the past, you can either click on this little button here that goes to details, or you can just click on the URL. I find this easier. Some people are afraid to do it because they think it'll run it. No, it doesn't run it. It just takes you to the details. It's just easier than clicking that little tiny button. So here's this. Remember, there was 3 requests that ran, or 4 or 5 that all ran around 300 seconds at the same time. Why? So, you know, now I'll just point out something that might be useful for some of you. This is the total request duration. This number in gray is the CPU time. Now, some of them have 40 seconds of CPU, 35 seconds, but this one only has 100 and only 47 milliseconds. But they're all finishing at about the same time and taking about the same duration. So it's not necessarily a CPU issue. So I'll just pick this one to say, well, what was it? If it wasn't CPU, what was it? Now, when this comes up, and again, usually it's instant. I've got some issues on my server and network. But anyway, when it comes up, this is the details of that request. Again, either when it's running or when it's finished. Here's the total time, there's the CPU time. Now, the first thing I would say to look at, and this is what I want you to learn, this is the most important thing I want you to learn from this presentation, is when you got a request that's either running or finished, you might have been doing some things. I would recommend you try these instead. First, go to the bottom of this detail page. Because at the bottom, on the right corner, bottom right corner, there's a total query, total time. This is saying whatever number of queries ran, they took a total of, here, 200, in my case, 233 seconds. Remember, the request was about 300. If I go back up to here to the top, it was 303. So 233 of the 303 were queries. There were 23 queries taking 233 seconds. Well, that's almost all the time. Now there's CPU time right here as well, and you add those two up, and that's still only 233 out of the 300. It's not all the time, but that might still be intriguing enough to you to go, well, I want to know why my queries took 200 seconds. But let me just say before I go on, if you came here and looked at this and it said, yeah, the total query total time was less than a second, and the CPU time was less than a second, but the request took 300 seconds, then there's no point looking at the queries because they only took a second. Even if there was 100 of them, if they only took a second, your issue is not your queries. But anyway, in my case, it is, and sometimes it will be for you. So if you come back up, remember, we're looking at the details of this particular request. There's a JDBC tab. Now, some of you found this and it's old news, but I help a lot of people who never dug into this stuff and are like, whoa, what? So yeah, so we're looking now at a grid that says, yes, there was 233 seconds spent doing queries. There were this many rows returned in total. You might find a much larger number sometime. They took this execution time versus total time. The difference there is this is typically the time in the database, and this is the time bringing the records back. Now, if we didn't bring back a lot of records, it begs the question, where's that time gone? But that's another subject. I don't want to dig too deep into it for now. But the bigger point, because everybody could learn from this, is that we saw we did have 200 seconds of query time. This is just repeating that with some other details. But down here at the bottom, this shows you by default the 30 slowest queries by descending total time. So remember, there were 23 queries taking 230 seconds. Well, one of them took 50 seconds, and one of them took 30, and one took 30, and 30, and 30. And here again is the difference between the total time and the DB time. So this took 28 seconds in the database and 50 seconds total. 28 in the database plus 22, plus 22, bringing it back. And that begs the question, why? Either was there a network problem that made it take a long time, or was there a problem with the CFML server or the box on which it was running that made queries slow? Again, sometimes you can't know that, but the point is, get what you can know. You can know, did we have slow queries? Yes. What were the slow queries? Here they are. Look at the SQL. Maybe there's some commonality of the slow ones. Maybe they all talk to a given table. Maybe they all ran around the same time. Remember, this was 300 seconds long. This shows when the queries started, and they all started within a second of each other. So that, lots of information you can get that you maybe didn't realize was there. All right, so that's that. So first, again, we're talking about a given request that was slow or is currently running slow. First thing to do is in the main tab, that's what you come to first, look at the bottom right corner, look at the total time, look at the CPU time. Now, what if they don't add up to the total or nowhere near the total? Well, then I would recommend you come to this Relations tab. Relations. Now, why? Well, when I click on Relations, you'll see that in FusionReactor 6, there's a nice graph at the top. Older versions didn't have it. But this is the total time, not really important. We already know that. This is the database time. In our case, not really that important. We already knew that. You see it's about 200 of the 300 seconds. But sometimes you'll see other things listed here. Like if you do a CF-HTTP, for those doing CFML, if you know what that is, or for you Java folks, if you do a HTTP client call or a java.net.url where you're calling out to some third-party server from within your application, if you do that, then your request is going to maybe be slow because you're waiting for that third-party site you're calling. Maybe it's a gateway payment processor. Maybe it's a Amazon S3. Maybe, right? It happened yesterday to a lot of people. Maybe it's you calling another page in your environment, but that page is slow. Well, this page is going to be slow, waiting for the requests out there to run. Now, I'm saying that if you do such calls out to third-party thing, they'll be tracked in here as either CF-HTTP or HTTP client. And it'll show you how many happened and how long they took. And here's where it gets really powerful, is that down here, if there were one, it would be listed. It would say that it was a CF-HTTP or HTTP client, and it would show you the URL that was called. Now that's not what this is. This is the total request time, 300 seconds. I'm saying if down here maybe we saw another one that said HTTP client or CF-HTTP, what it would show you here is the URL that was called from within your application and the duration that it took. And you might find, holy smokes, look at that, all 300 seconds was waiting for this third-party thing. In which case, your code isn't the problem, that third-party thing is the problem. And it can be very interesting to discover that when you dig into the details of a request. Now, before I'm going to continue talking about what you can get out of the details of a request, but just let me diverge to it for a second to show you that there is a feature in FusionReactor under transactions, slow transactions. So again, transactions, not JDBC, not requests, but transactions, slow transactions or longest transactions, either one. When that comes up, it's got a drop down in the top right corner and it focuses on web requests, but you can tell it, hey, have I had any CF-HTTPs or HTTP clients that were slow? Now, if you haven't had any, there wouldn't be this listed here, but if you have, and I have, I'm saying that even though that request didn't show an example of it, here's an example where I did have a request that did a CF-HTTP to, in my case, something called feed squirrel, and it took 21 seconds. And that's why that request was slow. Well, now here's another little cool thing. I'm going a bit beyond where I wanted to go, but just let me show this. Because if you come here and you find this and you go, what request did do that? Well, that's where you come to the details for this thing and go to relations. And it shows you what request. This is my request that did the CF-HTTP. So in fact, this is what that detail would look like if I found that request and said, hey, that guy took 25 seconds. Here is the CF-HTTP happening inside of it. Right here, down here. And it took, okay, that particular one took 1 second. Okay, there was a bunch of different ones, and they took time. And in some, they took that total time. Or maybe there's another one in there that eventually took the 23 seconds. There you go. So these guys, in this request, I did 2 for some reason, and they took this long. So I might go explore that to find out why that's so. Actually, it looks like they're not 2. One's tracked as an HTTP client, one's tracked as CF-HTTP. Technically, they're the same thing. Anyway, I don't want to dig any further into that. I just want you to realize that you can follow those kinds of paths of evidence. But let's go back to the particular request we were looking at, and I want you to appreciate a couple more things. So we said, if it says that there's total time being spent, and it's going to come up in a moment, you can see it's waiting to show request details, so that page will appear in a moment. I just hit the back button and my browser didn't refresh it as quickly as I'd like, so I just refreshed it. So we're looking at a particular request and its details. That's going to be in a moment the one that took 300 seconds, 233 of which was query time. So I said, first you see how much time was query time, how much was CPU time. If it's a lot of query time, you look into the JDBC tab and study that. If it's not adding up, you look at the Relations tab to see if that explains, was it a CF-HTTP? But this one wasn't. So remember, there were 70 seconds that we couldn't understand. Where'd those other 70 seconds go? Now that's often where people feel like they get stuck. Like, okay, the thing took 200 seconds, but it was no query time, no CF-HTTP time. Where were the 200 seconds spent? Now, if it's running, while it's running, you could do something called a stack trace. You'd see a button up in the top right corner to stack trace it, or when you're looking at the request activity page, there'd be a button to stack trace that request. And I'll do an example in a moment. But I want to say before I go there, what if you don't look at it when it's happening? What if you look at it after it's finished? Well, if you're in FusionReactor Ultimate, there's a new feature called Profiler, and we covered this in the Ultimate webinar a couple weeks ago. But there is this Profiler feature, and it will show you where the most time was spent in the request. So remember, this is a completed request, which took 300 seconds. If I click the Profiler and scroll down, it's a little hard for most people to grok, but I covered it in the webinar. But I can see by looking at this that 60% of the time was doing a query. That's already obvious. But look, here's 30% of time doing some module tag, CF module. I know from studying stack traces, this is a CF module tag, and 30% was spent on that, and 10% was spent on another, and then here's some other percentages over here. So you can sometimes start to piece things together, find even references to lines of code. But again, that was covered in the other webinar. I don't want to get into that now. But I'm saying the profiler is powerful if you have Ultimate, and especially when the request is completed. But let me just hop out for a second and kick off a request. You're not going to see me doing this, but I'm just going to kick off a request that does something that's going to take a little bit of time. Just a moment. Okay, so now let's come back to this display. And if I come to my metrics web metrics, first I want you all to learn how to interpret and understand this. This is going to show me when it populates in a moment. Again, I've got issues, but there's a running request, maybe a couple for whatever reason, maybe only one, maybe two or three, but that light green is saying I have a running request. Notice there's no query running. It's not a query. And it's taken a long time. This light blue is saying it's up to 15 seconds or 11 seconds by now. Well, now if I go to requests activity, it's running. And there may be others running, but I want to focus on one in particular. So this one called create PDF. That's what I kicked off, and it's running. And I'm saying if I look, I'll go ahead and do it twice. I want you to see that if I come in here and look at the details, there's no query time. There's not even any CPU time. Where's the time being spent? And if I look at relations, there's nothing. Nothing's obvious. Why is this thing taking a long time? This is the request. At the moment, it's still taking 44 seconds. So this is an example where I need to do the stack trace. Now the request is about to end because I told it to take 60 seconds. But I want you to see I could stack trace it there, or I could back up and here, I could stack trace it here. Now I'll go ahead and try it because it looks like it's still running. So bam, I've done this thing called the stack trace while it was running. That's the key. You can only do this while it's running. And I covered this in some other webinars, but the point is you can look at this and without too much experience, with just a little bit of guidance that I covered in the other webinars, you can come down here and usually tell, in the case of CFML, literally what line of CFML code is running. And if I keep coming down here, eventually I see this createPDF.cfm was running line 19, and that was doing a CF document tag. That's what this is telling me. It's a CF document tag. Well, I've helped a lot of people find out that their long-running requests were slow because of CF document issues. CF document's a tag that creates PDF, and there's all kinds of reasons that it can be slow, but the point is, that's what this is doing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page, which will stack trace it again. If it's still running, it'll say, well, here's what I'm doing now. If it's finished, it'll say, oh, the request is finished. And it looks like it did refresh, so it is still running. And I just want you to notice that I already know, in this case, it's still going to be saying that it's running line 19. And if you do multiple stack traces in a row and the request is still running and it says it's on the same line of code, well, there's your smoking gun. And you could literally, if you're in Windows, just there's your path. If it's Linux or Mac or Unix, it'll show you a Linux path. But the point is you can just grab that path, go open that file on the server, and this colon line number is saying that it's line 19 that it's running. And I'm telling you, I'd look at it and it would be a CF document tag. And you might want to go find out why is that tag slow. And it might be a CF document tag. It might be a CF HTTP, but you could have seen that in the relations. It might be a CF query, but you could have seen that in the JDBC tab. It could be anything. It could be a CF file. And again, I'm talking to CF people. But it could be a file IO call in Java or CFML. It could be a directory lookup. It could be a call out, again, to some remote service using any number of potential protocols, mail servers, FTP servers, whatever. So you'll find out by stack tracing and just scrolling down and looking. What you're doing is you're looking, in the case of CFML, you're looking for the first reference that says something.cfm or something.cfc. And then you go up from there. And again, this is covered in other webinars, so I just want you to appreciate that you can see literally down to the line of code what requests, when a request is running, what's it doing? And see, this one's already finished, so you can't look at it anymore. Just ignore whatever it's doing now because it's not the same request anymore. The request that was running has finished. You should go back, and I won't have any running now because that was the only one I kicked it off to artificially cause a problem. All right, so let's get on back to the presentation. So again, here's all the stuff that I showed you. You can come back and look at that yourself to be reminded of the things that we did. Okay. And there's the URL for getting to the ultimate webinar that talked about the profiler feature. And if you have some code that's just not running as expected, and you want to know where it's going, why is it running this line and not that line, whatever, that's where the step debugger in FusionReactor comes in, and that's in the Ultimate Edition, and that was covered in that webinar as well. So sometimes the debugger could be useful for troubleshooting. It depends on the nature. I'm talking about slow, long-running requests. The debugger wouldn't help you other than to say that's where it's stopped, but stack trace can tell you that. But the debugger is particularly valuable to understand the values of variables at a point in time at a particular line, to watch what lines it's stepping through. Is it going where you expect? Can you use it to understand your code and how it works? So that's a different way of using the tools for troubleshooting. All right, let's move on. I said you may have a situation of many slow running requests, and I would want you to think about what might be different. I've already given some clues. You mostly use the same approach, but you need to understand why are the many running. So you want to look at the URLs of the many running. Is there any commonality? Are they all the same domain? Are they all the same URL, the same page that's being requested? Do they have the same query string? Are they from the same IP address? Do they show the same start times? I've hinted at some of these things already. I'm saying when you look at that list of running requests in the request activity page, before you dive into the details of each one, stop and look at the big picture and say, is there anything I can discern about these running requests? Because that might be helpful. And then you would dive in, and you could look at those other tools like the metrics web metrics and the slow requests and things like that. You might get some interesting information by understanding the big picture. I also want to remind you and make sure you're aware of this, and we covered this in other webinars. FusionReactor's got a notion of crash protection alert emails. And you set them up, for instance, to say when X number of requests have been running over Y seconds, I want to know about it. Now, some of you will go, I don't need another email. My users will tell me that the problem is happening. No, that's not the point. The point is the email alert, this crash protection alert, will have in it a stack trace of every running request. Now you understand what that's about. You could look at that email, and maybe it happened this morning at 11 o'clock in the morning. Well, you could look at that email that you got at 11 in the morning. Maybe you've already restarted your app server since then, but you could look at that email and look at the requests that were running. It shows you a list of the requests that are running, and then look at the stack traces below, and you can connect the dots. Now, again, I covered that in another webinar, and it's still more in a video on YouTube, so I talk about that in other resources. But you can Google it. If you just Google FusionReactor Crash Protection Alerts YouTube, you'll be taken right to the video. There's also a link on the FusionReactor website to the videos, including the ones on YouTube. So anyway, the alerts can be valuable for understanding a situation of many requests, because you might start getting those emails like while you're working on something else. All of a sudden you're getting a bunch of alerts, and I would say if you're getting a bunch of alerts one after another showing many requests running slow, you want to go figure out what's going on, and you want to start by looking at the alerts, and then go look at FusionReactor if you can get into it. And if you can't, then maybe the alerts will be all you have to go on. So to learn more about the alerts, see the webinar called Configuring FusionReactor for Action. And also, there are some FusionReactor configuration changes that could help with making some of these resources be more useful, and that's covered in another in that webinar. I also want to say to beware that sometimes the problem is not going to be in your app server. Now, I'm not saying you won't see slow requests. You may. But I'm saying you might study them the way I've talked about, and you'll go, I'm just not seeing any commonality. The requests that are slow, they're running different tags. They're maybe not running any tag at all. They're doing setup of a cached query. They're trying to get a connection to the JDBC connection pool, whatever. And I know that's a little foreign language to some of you, but my point is sometimes you will find that there's just no commonality in the many running requests. And I've found that that often is an indication that the problem is outside of your app server. Something else on the box might be running and stealing resources. Now, FusionReactor's got a system resources page for those on Enterprise, but you can also use your OS tools, Task Manager in Windows, Top in Linux, the Activity Monitor in Mac, and look at that and see, are there other requests, are there other processes running, using a lot of CPU, using a lot of memory? Is the total memory on the box running out? Is the total CPU on the box used up? And it's not from your CFML or Java server. So just look at those things, because sometimes people blame their app server because that's where the requests are slow and the users are saying, I can't get a response. But if you dig a little bit, you find out, hey, the app server is the victim. The problem is something else. And I've seen it be all kinds of things. I've seen it be antivirus tools running on the server. I've seen backups running at the same time. Same on the database server. Your requests may be piling up. When you dig into it, it says it's slow query, but you look into the database and you say, why are those queries slow? And you look out and you find out, oh, they're slow because something's using up all the memory on the database box, or something else is running on the box stealing CPU. So you just have to keep a big picture perspective. Sometimes it's not what you think it is. Now, one other thing I want to mention that I don't think I've mentioned in any other webinars before, let me go ahead and recreate that problem of that slow running request and come back into the display where we'll see under metrics, web metrics, that I said we see that there's 3 slow running requests. Now, if I'd had an alert set up to fire when there were 3 slow running requests, I'd be getting an alert now every minute. And if this problem went on for minutes or hours, I'd be getting 60 alerts an hour. Or if I looked at this graph might eventually just fill up bigger and bigger. This one is going higher and higher and higher. If I'm saying, if you've got a request that's running for 1,000 seconds, 1,000,000 seconds, or many requests, sometimes you're going to want to say, you know what, I can't do anything about those. They're not hurting anything. I've already dug into them. They're not really hurting anything. I wish I could just ignore them. Well, FusionReactor has a way for you to ignore them. If you go to Requests Activity and you see the requests running, and they're running for a long time, and you want to ignore them, say, stop affecting my graphs, stop affecting my alerts. That's what this last button is, stop tracking. So I'm going to click stop tracking, stop tracking, stop tracking. Now, it says that they've already finished, but let's just say they had been running still. My point is they would still be listed here, but if you went back to the metrics, web metrics, immediately you'd have seen them no longer appearing on this metrics page. This graph will have immediately dropped, this graph will have immediately dropped. Now there must still be some running. I'll just go back and check that out and refresh it because this might be a little bit outdated. Okay, stop tracking that. Metrics inhibited. Stop tracking that. It says it's already finished. That's weird because it's still listed here. And stop tracking that's weird. So I don't know what's happening there because I've refreshed this page. They shouldn't be there. So there's something weird going on there. They're not going up in time as we refresh it. They both say 14 seconds, and it's now about 5 seconds later. Almost 10 seconds later. Okay, they are. I don't know what's going on there because, yeah, it says it's already finished. Can't stop tracking. But I don't want to get stuck on this. The point is, this works. I've used it all the time with lots of people. If you see a bunch of requests running and you want to see the graphs stopped showing, that may be that they finally finished, but if things work the way they're supposed to work, the point is if you stop tracking, they no longer appear in the graph and they no longer cause you get alerts. But they are still listed. If they're still running, they would still be listed in the request activity page. And when they finish, they'll still be listed on the slow request page. So they don't affect you seeing the information in those lists of requests, but they just affect the graphs and the alerts. And I just think that's pretty valuable because there's times when you're getting lots of alerts and you already understand the problem and you don't want to keep getting the alerts and there's nothing you can do about them. Maybe you can't kill them because there's a problem in the database server and they're not affecting anything, so you just want to let them run. Anyway, that's that. All right, wrapping up. I mentioned earlier you can also use FusionReactor to understand a recent crash or restart, and that's where you need to use those alerts, FusionReactor's logs, your application server's logs, because the FusionReactor interface, as you may know, gets wiped clean. When you restart the instance, everything in there is gone. Now some people go, oh, that's just terrible. How can I use such a tool? I can't believe it does that. Well, again, the point is you can do post-crash troubleshooting, and we do have a webinar on it, and here's the URL for it, where I go over in considerable depth using the FusionReactor logs, the FusionReactor alerts, and the application server logs, and some OS logs that might be able to give you some insight into what happened hours ago or days ago, even though FusionReactor has nothing about it in its interface anymore. Okay, so trying to wrap up. We've seen there's several ways to do troubleshooting using FusionReactor. You can use it to understand what's going on currently, and that's more important than I think many people realize, and there's a lot more to do that than most people realize. And then you can dive into a given slow request, whether it's running or finished, and use those features I showed you. And then you can also try to understand many slow requests by looking at the context of what's going on, look at the details, and then again you can understand the cause of a recent crash. And as I said, besides what I've shared today, these other webinars get into more detail. So I hope nobody's offended by me saying go see that other webinar. If I did it all here in this one, we'd go on for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. So I'm trying to just say there's more detail. Go check it out. And one last thing I want to end with that was just announced within the last week or two, and I've got a URL for it here, is FusionReactor now has a developer edition. It's actually had it for a while, but the news was just made finally public. There is a developer edition. It basically has the ultimate features. So the debugger, the profiler, everything that's in enterprise, everything's in standard. It's meant for development purposes, and it's much less expensive, and you can read more about it at this URL. And if you just Google FusionReactor Developer Edition, you'll find it if you don't want to try to note every bit of this URL. But yeah, there is a developer edition meant to be used only in development, not in production. So don't try to play games with that. Find that out. All right. So then I mentioned too earlier that there are some other upcoming webinars, and in particular, the next one we're planning to do is on setting up and using the FusionReactor Enterprise dashboard. That date hasn't been announced. It will probably be in a couple weeks, and we'll announce that as soon as it's ready. And some people who use FusionReactor Enterprise and Ultimate sometimes don't ever use this dashboard, and it's one of the main features of the Enterprise Edition. So we'll cover that. And there's still others being planned. Like I said, we'll do another troubleshooting one, taking questions live from you and diving into them, perhaps even showing your screen if you'd like, and showing everybody how to use FusionReactor to solve your particular problem. We'll see about that. It's not as easy as it sounds. Audio problems typically are a big problem. So anyway, for that webinar and the others, keep an eye on FusionReactor.com/webinar. And as always, I like to end by showing you resources for you to learn more, so you can learn much more about FusionReactor, including docs and videos and tech notes and forums at the FusionReactor website. And if you have questions, I'll take them in a moment. I'll turn to your questions if you have them. But besides talking to me, maybe you don't want to ask them publicly, or maybe you want to share some feedback about the webinar and you don't want to give it to me, maybe. You can email sales@FusionReactor.com, and then if you have problems, you can email support@FusionReactor.com. So definitely use those resources. They're great, guys and ladies. And here's the number in the US to call, which will reach usually sales. It's not meant to be used for support. It's really a sales address, a phone number, but they'll guide you if you're using the wrong resource. And again, we do welcome your feedback on these webinars and other ones you might like to see. So let us know at those addresses, and they'll pass information on to me. All right, so let's move on now to questions and answers, and I'm going to switch to the display. There you go. Yeah, so back when I was talking about sessions, somebody had asked what constitutes a session in FusionReactor. Now, Mike, are you still here? And if you're still here, tell me what application server you use. Is it a Java application server? Is it a CFML server? And while I wait for you to answer that, let me look at the other questions. Somebody lost screen sharing, but again, nobody else complained of that, Dave, so it must have been on your end. Are other webinars available? Yep, so you see I answered that several minutes later. Actually, wait a minute, that was at 1:53. You must have missed, I showed you that. So anyway, the high CPU spikes seem to correspond to GC and heap size. How would you solve or explore this deeper? Well, we do have a few minutes. I may take a look at that, and we'll prove if what you think is so, because we can. And I meant to mention in passing, I have covered it in other webinars. Mike says he's using CF11. All right, so let me answer his question. He said, what constitutes a session in FusionReactor? Well, let's be clear. It's not a session in FusionReactor. I don't think that's what you meant, but you mean, what does FusionReactor mean? What FusionReactor means is what, in your case, ColdFusion11 means. A session is a session. So we're talking about ColdFusion sessions in that case, and a session is, you know, a request that hits a CF application tag or an application CFC that enables session management. And the first time someone comes to your site and hits that thing that creates that session, a session gets created. And there's a timeout that's set in your code or in the application or in the administrator, and the session lasts as long as you tell it to last. And unfortunately, what happens with spiders and bots and hackers and monitors is they come in and they cause your app server, whether it's CF or Rilo or Lucity or Java, Tomcat, WebSphere, doesn't matter. They end up creating sometimes hundreds of sessions a minute, because every page they visit, as a spider, bot, or other automated tool, every page they visit creates a new session. For real people, they don't tend to do that. They create one session and use it over and over. That's how most web applications take advantage of sessions. But anyway, I don't want to get into this in any more detail. The point is you can look at the number of sessions. Before I get into the CPU spike question, one last question. Can FusionReactor be used to track memory leaks? Okay, so now we don't have time in this to get into that. We covered it some in the other webinars. And Christopher, if you feel that you've seen all of them and you still felt somehow your question isn't answered, that'd be a great one to ask. Let's have a specific troubleshooting one on troubleshooting memory leaks. I just can't right now remember which ones covered it. I'm pretty confident we have covered it. But anyway, let's say that, well, we don't have a leak on mine, right? Because we saw there was no, well, I won't say there was a little bit of high memory use. Just a second to get back to my FusionReactor display. And first, notice, my memory's not that high. It's, if I put the mouse over here, and I don't know why, there you go, my pop-ups. Well, actually it is 651 out of 704 allocated in max. I could be using 700 meg. That's a weird number. I don't think I am. Maybe it is. Anyway, the point is, before you go concluding that you're using all this memory, one thing I would point out is that there is a feature in FusionReactor to do garbage collection. I'm really pretty sure I've covered this before, but just real quickly, there's a button down here. And by doing that, we'd be saying to the JVM, hey, of these, in my case, 659 meg worth of stuff that's in memory, is it all really still in use? Because maybe it's old stuff and you've just been lazy about garbage collecting it. So I could click this garbage collection button and it would try to do it. Now, before I do it, somebody else asserted he thinks that my CPU spikes are about garbage collection happening under the covers, not because I'm doing a button, but because it happened under the covers. Well, before we dig into that, let me just show you that this graph is showing there's other non-CF CPU, in my case, spiking. So that's not my CF server. But there's this spike, and he's wondering if these spikes correlate to garbage collections that may be happening. Maybe he's seen that happen on his server or other servers. Well, look, we don't have to guess. Under resources, and this addresses the other guy's question too, under resources, garbage collection. FusionReactor tracks, is garbage collection happening? So in a moment, I'm going to see a graph, and it shows me two kinds of garbage collections that can happen. One is what are called minor GCs, scavenges, and one are major GCs, or mark sweeps. And different GC algorithms might lead to slightly different words, but in concept, it's generally the case that these are minor GCs and major GCs. And here we see the number of them happening. And so now it is interesting. It does support what he asserted, but I didn't want to confirm that until we absolutely saw it. So yeah, there's one happening about every 20, 30 seconds. And they're taking on average a few seconds. One time it took about 12 seconds. This time, again, it took about 12 seconds. So yes, in this case, it does look I'm running low on memory. Now, these are GCs happening by the JVM doing it, and that shouldn't be happening frequently. Let me be clear about this. You might come in and see lots of green ones happening very fast and very often. I'm saying you shouldn't see a lot of the blue ones, either happening often or taking long. Now, the fact that it's happening means that it is running low on memory. Somebody said, is there a leak? Well, you don't want to jump to the conclusion that there's a leak. This is where I think we need to have a whole webinar. There can be all kinds of reasons that memory use is high. It could be sessions. There could be lots of sessions holding lots of stuff. Could be, again, talking in CFML terms, application scope usage, server scope usage. Those live beyond the life of a request. It could be query caching. Could be CFML caching with cache functions. Anything that lives beyond the life of request would live in the heap longer than the life of the request and could live there for a long time and could make the memory go up and up and up. Well, that's not a leak. That's some feature you're using that maybe intentionally or unintentionally is leading to objects living a long time and a large number of them. And that uses a lot of memory. And eventually, yeah, you could run out of memory and get out of memory errors. Now, my server's been running fine. I mean, my requests are generally running quickly. Remember, we looked at requests activity, and we'd seen that almost all my requests were sub-millisecond. Sorry, I meant requests history. And I know we're going a minute over in a minute or two, but let me just make this point. Even though I've got that high CPU problem, look, these requests in the past 20, 30 seconds have all been sub-millisecond. So it's not that all my requests are slow. There's 1.3 seconds. There's 3 seconds. There's 7 seconds. Now, it could be that that 7 seconds is because at the very moment that ran, a garbage collection happened, and that made that request slow because it ran with garbage collection. And you may or may not be able to discern that by digging into things. I'll just take a quick look at the profiler and see. I should have looked and seen, was there slow queries, right? I'm failing my own test. But let's just see if the profiler shows where time was spent. If it was one thing, we could have maybe guessed, could that thing be slow because of garbage collections happening? Yeah, look at that. At the very moment that request was running, the JVM was doing a garbage collection. That's the JVM doing a garbage collection. I didn't kick one off. It's doing it itself. So yes, that request, it's just coincidental that we happened to pick a request that did run during that GC. Now again, backing up, we want to find out why the memory's use is high. You could also increase the heap size, but you don't want to keep chasing that because eventually you might hit the limit of your box's available memory. You want to find out what's using memory. Now again, I'm only using 700 meg. Again, my server generally runs really well and I don't need a lot of memory, but clearly something is holding up the 700 meg. And we could dig in, but again, we don't have time to go into that. Just I gave you some insights into the things we'd look at. And there are features in, we saw the sessions, there's also under CF metrics and system metrics, I could see query caching that's going on in CFML. I believe it's under CF metrics. I could see how many queries are in my query cache. Is it this one? No, it was the other one. But anyway, there is one, and you can see how many, and maybe I could be having a lot of queries in the query cache. And then number of, there you go, there's cached queries. Graph about to come up in a moment to show me how many queries in a query cache. So anyway, those are things you could explore. 300-ish, I wouldn't think that'd be enough to contribute. But let's be clear, the number of queries in the cache doesn't really talk about the size. I could have some really big queries. I don't think I do. So there's any number of other possibilities that could explain it. I don't want to dig into it now because we're at the end of our time. So let me go back to looking at the any questions that came up. Okay, cool. Nothing else has come up since then. So again, Christopher, send an email to the sales address saying that you'd like to see a webinar on digging into troubleshooting memory problems, and that would be a good one to do. So I don't see any other questions. I'll assume there aren't any more, so let's go ahead and call it at this point. Thanks all very much for coming along. Again, the recording will be shared with you by email when we're finished. May take a couple days before you get the email, but you'll be able to come back and watch this and share it with folks. And we look forward to you continuing to use FusionReactor to solve your problems. And with that, we'll say goodbye. See ya. Thanks, everybody. I see you saying thank yous. Thank you.